Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, the Buddha's teachings are recorded and recited everywhere. But what about the stories of the Buddha teaching? How they developed over time? Can I read about the history of the development of the community of Buddhists as the teaching has traveled far?
Yes, there are many histories. Some are better than others, but they all document the life of the Buddha and how people have recorded and transmitted his teaching around the world.
Fascinating. How do they categorize his teaching? People have interpreted it and responded to it differently over time, and so have taught it differently, leading to development of different sects.
That is true, they have. The broadest categories are the Arhat path, the Bodhisattva path, and the Vajra path.
I imagine they all have interesting and unique idiosyncrasies.
They do, but they all share a deep reverence for the teaching of the Buddha, however they have interpreted it. Also, they are each deeply committed to the teaching itself, exemplifying compassion and loving kindness at every stage.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be continuing our introductory series on Buddhism. Where can I read and learn about Buddhist history? What kinds of Buddhism are there? What if nobody in my area practices Buddhism? We hope you enjoy. So, where can I read and learn about Buddhist history?
In answering this question, we need to be conscious of what sorts of information we are looking for and what we want to do with that information. In academia, two very broad orientations are often taught, the emic and the etic. In casual terms, these are the insider and the outsider orientations respectively. Calling them insider or outsider, we mean the perspective of the author of the source in question, not our own perspectives. This challenges you to think critically about the author of the source you have. Is the author of the book you are reading a European white Christian scholar of Buddhism writing for other European academics? Or are they an East Asian Buddhist writing for other Buddhists? By considering these points, it will become clear that depending on who wrote the source, who they wrote it for, and what their perspective is with regards to the subject matter, there might be obvious biases, opinions, or assumptions in the work. Similarly, as the reader, you might use the source or view your own relationship to it very differently. I think that understanding your relationship with the source from the start is critically important. What are you looking for? Who do you want to find it from? What are you going to do with what you find? You can do almost whatever you want when you find it, but you should assess your intentions ahead of time and make a plan accordingly. From the emic or insider perspective, you can read about Buddhist history from the following texts. One that I recommend is the English translation of the Buddha Charita, known in English as The Life of the Buddha, written by the Buddhist monk Ashvaghosha and translated by Patrick Olivelle. This is a narration by a Buddhist monk of the life and times of Siddhartha Gautama, written in epic poem style in around the 2nd century CE. This is mostly agreed upon by Buddhists to contain the true and comprehensive life history of Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha. It follows him from before his birth until death. Unfortunately, the Sanskrit Buddha Charita is incomplete because only around half of the original manuscript survives. There is, however, a complete Tibetan and Chinese manuscript out there, and that's what Olivelle uses for the second half of his translation. This is a great narration of the earliest history of Buddhism, concerning the life of the Buddha himself. For more histories on early Buddhism, particularly early sectarian history, we will have to briefly step outside of the emic perspective and into the etic or outsider's perspective. For an etic perspective, there are many histories out there that are scholarly, but still easy to read and understand. There are the following. Carl Olson's 2005 book, The Different Paths of Buddhism, A Narrative Historical Introduction. Edward Conze's 2008 book, Buddhism, A Short History. Richard F. Gombrich's 1997 book, How Buddhism Began. These are all written by modern Western scholars of Buddhism, but they are written with the intention of teaching the roots and origins of Buddhism to introductory learners. They will be from the outsider perspective, and so they won't have opinions and suggestions for how to practice Buddhism correctly, which schools of Buddhism are right or wrong, or what the correct and essential version of Buddhism is. But they will present the landscape for early Buddhist history, discussing the disciples, schools, and the sequence of events from the time of the Buddha's life and after. No single one of these sources is comprehensive on its own, and so I actually recommend that you read as many of them as you can. Since they're from the Edik perspective, they may have biases. They may be correcting and recorrecting portions of the narrative as new information comes to light, or they may disagree on certain historical events. These should cover Buddhist history up to at least the 1st century CE, so that is around 500 years from the birth of Shakyamuni to Buddhism's first transmission into China via the Silk Route. After that, Buddhism's history gets exponentially more complicated and speeds up a great deal. More happens in less time because Buddhism proliferates at a much higher rate than it did in India. There are many new developments in terms of new trends of Buddhist thinking, Buddhist thinkers, new schools of Buddhism, new ritual traditions, and a different religious and cultural landscape. Because of that, there are also far more histories covering this period of Buddhism, and they are more complicated and difficult to understand. Nevertheless, if you're willing to wade into it, I have 3 recommendations. Richard Foltz's 2010 book, Religions of the Silk Road. Paul Williams's 2005, Buddhism, Buddhist Origins and the Early History of Buddhism in South and Southeast Asia. And Erik Zurcher's 2007, The Buddhist Conquest of China. These are going to be slightly harder or higher level reads than the previous recommendations, but if you're ready, they're really good, and you'll learn a lot.
What kinds of Buddhism are there?
There are many, many types of Buddhism, more than we've discussed or could discuss on this show. Categorizing religious traditions is hard because distinctions are constructed either arbitrarily, making them meaningless, or they're constructed with an agenda in mind, which is meaningful but potentially problematic. We also tend to classify sects into discrete categories with defined boundaries, when the reality is more of a spectrum that gradually evolves. Nevertheless, different Buddhist schools exist, and we need to grapple with them to understand Buddhism. Just remember, there is overlap between categories, and different types of Buddhism coexist, interact, and shape each other over the course of history. I think that in the most broad sense, the majority of types of Buddhism that still exist today fit into one of 3 categories: Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. Theravada is a descendant of one of the earliest schools of Buddhism, known as the Vibhajyavada. This is one of the 2 communities that arose as the result of a schism in the Buddhist community after the Second Buddhist Council, held around 100 years after the death of the Buddha, the other being the Mahasamgika. The Mahasamgika wanted to reform and loosen the rules for monks and nuns, and the Vibhajyavada wanted to make them stricter, and so they split off, and Theravada is the modern-day descendant of that group. Theravada emphasizes practicing and perfecting the moral precepts of Buddhism as a means of attaining enlightenment. Monks in that tradition follow the rules of celibacy and the prohibitions against handling money, keeping and farming food, and against consuming intoxicants very seriously. There are a plethora of rules for monks and nuns, and they believe that through exertion in following these rules over many lifetimes, they will eventually achieve enlightenment. There are several different types of Theravada Buddhism, such as Indian Theravada, the Vipassana movement, and the Thai forest tradition. These are all mainly popular in India and Southeast Asia, except for Vietnam, which is notoriously Mahayana Buddhist. Mahayana is a historically later development in Buddhism, and it emphasizes the Bodhisattva path, which emphasizes the salvation of all sentient beings everywhere through expedient means, over working to achieve enlightenment for just yourself through morality. To a certain extent, Mahayana is a descendant of the Mahasamgika group mentioned previously. Expedient means, also called upaya in Sanskrit, is the most important difference between Mahayana and Theravada. Theravada Buddhists want world peace and enlightenment for all just as much as anybody else, but they reject expedient means as a means of achieving that goal, because expedient means can take forms that Theravada practitioners disagree with. Similarly, Theravada regards saving all sentient beings everywhere as being too difficult for any individual or group of people to accomplish. By contrast, Mahayana Buddhists believe that perfecting morality over many lifetimes is also hard to do, and so many of the moral precepts in Mahayana are loosened, reimagined, or ignored. Also, concepts such as faith become more emphasized as easier and faster means to achieve enlightenment. Some types of Mahayana are Zen, Pure Land, and Huayan Buddhism. These schools are most commonly practiced in East Asia, particularly China, Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. Vajrayana is historically the youngest category of Buddhism, also called esoteric Buddhism or tantric Buddhism. This form of Buddhism emphasizes practices which are aimed at the absolute fastest realization of Buddhahood that is possible. The way that this is accomplished is through the use of sacred prayers, body poses, or meditative contemplations. These are sacred because they are regarded as being the true, secret, and most effective of the Buddha's teachings and practices, compared to all of his other teachings, which took longer to achieve and were more difficult to practice, but were easier for the masses to understand. Sacred prayers can take several forms, such as short recitations called mantras, or medium-length recitations called dharani, or long-form recitations called tantra. They also utilize mudra, or hand poses that serve various purposes in esoteric Buddhism. Sacred meditative contemplations include intricate mental visualizations while meditating, as well as mandalas, sacred images that some Buddhists create and use for worship and ritual. Something that is very distinct about Vajrayana is that it is initiatory. Many teachings are kept secret and only revealed through initiation. Those who have not been initiated are not supposed to have access to the teachings, usually because they're regarded as being dangerous in the hands of people without proper instruction from a teacher. This makes it uniquely hard to study compared to other types of Buddhism, where there are no protected secret teachings. Types of Vajrayana include Japanese Shingon Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, and Tendai Buddhism. Vajrayana often has a lot of overlap with Mahayana, and some schools of Vajrayana, such as Shingon and Tendai, are simultaneously regarded as Mahayana Buddhism. I'd like to also add a separate category that has a lot of overlap with these categories, but doesn't really belong to any one of them, and that is modern New Age Buddhism, which can also be called secular Buddhism. As I argue in episodes 77 through 79, this is not actually Buddhism, but it is still out there, and it needs to be acknowledged. This Buddhism has only come around in the last 50-ish years, and it's primarily popular among Americans and Europeans. Secular Buddhism caters to people who are rejecting Christianity, but are seeking something that they can consider spiritually fulfilling. We discuss it a lot on the show, so I won't go into it in depth here, but be aware/beware of secular Buddhism.
What if nobody in my area practices Buddhism?
Temples all over the world are creating online presences. They stream their services and rituals online, and invite members from all over the world to come and watch and participate, almost always for free. My own local temple, Seattle Koyasan Buddhist Temple, live streams all of their ritual services, their regular weekly services, meditations, and Goma fire rituals.
Other temples and communities that have online presence includes Seattle Choeizan Enkyoji, which is Nichiren Buddhism, Bhante Jayasara's Maggasekha community, which is Theravada, and Buddhist Churches of America, which covers multiple types of Buddhism. For the communities with non-English names, we will list spellings in the show notes. There are many other good communities you can get involved with. If you see one that looks interesting to you, check them out.
During the pandemic, I also carried out an extensive research project concerning Buddhist temples in Japan and how they were responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. This project will eventually get its own episode on the Research Project series, but in short, it was centered around the doctrine and language that Japanese Buddhist temples were using to talk about the pandemic, as well as online ritual services. There was a period of time before the vaccines came out where even Buddhist funerals were taking place over Skype. Japanese Buddhist temples, especially in more rural areas, have been struggling financially for the last several decades due to a number of factors. One big reason that they've been struggling is that Japanese Buddhist temples have historically been inherited from father to son, and more sons are refusing to take over the temples and instead are picking more lucrative careers in cities, so many Buddhist temples are being abandoned, or they're struggling to be staffed. Additionally, there's also a declining birth rate, meaning that there's fewer and fewer children to inherit. Additionally, people are less and less outwardly religious, and so they don't often go to temples, and so there's less donation revenue flowing in. Along comes the pandemic in 2020, nearly all donation revenue stops because people are staying home, and temples now have two huge financial burdens on their hands. One, They have an increase in funerary duties, which are often a break-even or a loss for most temples, due to the difficulty and expense of carrying them out. And 2, they now have to digitize and create an online presence to keep up engagement with their community. Japan is often imagined as a techno-utopia by Westerners, but most Japanese Buddhist temples, again especially rural ones, had no online presence at all prior to 2020. Some rural towns don't even have a wired internet connection, or they only have 1 or 2 connection points and lack the rest of the infrastructure necessary to build out an online presence for any of the businesses, temples, or homes there. Most monks are also older and serve older people, and thus they're not as proficient with technology, so they were faced with that difficulty as well. When temples did get around to creating online presences, they had a time crunch, a money crunch, and a resource crunch. Nevertheless, they did it, and there are now more websites, more social media pages, and more live streams for Japanese Buddhist temples than there ever have been. I will link some in the show notes. Thus, the problem of how to connect with communities and temples online is progressively being solved by temples all over the world. Aside from official temples, there are also online spaces that are centered around Buddhism. For these, I must warn you to proceed with caution, because there is a lot of misinformation, trolls, and toxicity on the internet, and Buddhist spaces are unfortunately not immune to this. There are also people who are acting in good faith, but are misinformed or have misunderstood certain teachings. However, while these spaces are out there, there are still plenty of positive and informative ones. I don't have any recommendations offhand, but these places do exist. Just be careful and cautious in finding them.
We hope you enjoyed this week's entry into our ongoing introductory series on Buddhism. Join us next week where we will be discussing sutras. What is a sutra? What do I do with it? What sutras are the best for learning the basics of Buddhism? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. If you like our show and you want to support us, we ask instead that you send that support to Black families that have been displaced by the LA wildfires. You can find a directory of GoFundMe pages for these families in the show notes. Thank you. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.